All right, we're going to go ahead and get started here. I think we've got 35 people or so with us so far. We had about 82 people register for today's event. So just an introduction, this is the first virtual Adaptive Ag Water Symposium. This event was supported by a grant from Western Extension Risk Management Education and NIFA, so USDA National Institute for Food and Agriculture. The Dry Farming Institute is a new nonprofit organization that got this grant. So I want to acknowledge all of our partners listed here on this, this first slide. There are a lot of hands that went into doing outreach and organizing and coordinating this whole event. Just an introduction, I realize many of you have not heard about the Dry Farming Institute. So I just wanted to give you a little background. So my day job is with the Oregon State University Extension Service, and we started doing some work on dry farming back in 2013. So we've done some case studies and demonstrations starting in 2015. You can see the timeline here on the bottom. The Dry Farming Collaborative is a group that evolved from this work. So this is a group of growers, extension educators, researchers, plant breeders that are all partnering to increase knowledge about how to grow with less water. So this evolved in 2016, 2017 into a multifaceted participatory research project with growers in the Maritime Pacific Northwest and beyond. Now there's in our Facebook group, there's about 1,000 members at this point and international representation. So it's from this group, the Dry Farming Collaborative, that the Dry Farming Institute emerged from. You can see our founding board members up there in the top right-hand corner. On the first two on the top left and then the middle there are myself and Matt. So Matt and I are your hosts and facilitators for today's event. And the mission of the Dry Farming Institute is to empower growers to thrive with less water. So that's just a brief background. And this whole event, so this, I mentioned our funders are Western Extension Risk Management Education and NIFA. So this Adaptive Ag Water Symposium was designed to complement and expand upon the virtual field tours we did with the Dry Farming Project this summer. So those happened in August, September, but they're all recorded and available on the Small Farms Dry Farming page, which is listed right there on the screen. So the whole point of this field tour series was to educate growers on some research that was happening with both farmers and university and many partners related to dry farming and techniques to support growing without supplemental irrigation in our Maritime Pacific Northwest climate. So here we are today, and we have a symposium organized for you. And originally this was going to be a full day event. And this grant that we got to host this was going to be seed money because we were going to make this a Western region event for the Western US and invite people from all over. But with 2020, COVID and numerous other things, this of course got downsized to be a virtual event. So it's awesome though that we have people attending today's symposium that are from all over the world. It's definitely Oregon centric, but I noticed in our registration of the 82 people that registered, we have South Africa, Brazil, India, Texas. So thank you all for attending today. And that's one of the powers of this virtual platform, is that we don't have to physically be present and we have participation from a wider geographical area. So our speakers we're going to start with Andrew Millison today, talking about landscape rehydration with water harvesting structures. We have Amy Landvoigt of the Oregon Water Resources Department coming up second. talking about Oregon's ag water future and water law. And then we have Matt Delaney, who is also our facilitator today, that's going to be giving our last session on drought, wildfire risk, and climate change. And then this is just a little bit of a more up close look at our agenda, so you know what to expect today. I know that some people are just attending 1 or 2 sessions, and a lot of people have other things going on. So we have a healthy break designed in between each session. It'll be 45 minutes. And and then at the very end, I'm going to be sharing throughout, since a lot of folks are not attending the whole symposium, we have an evaluation. This is a free event to attend, and we did get funding to host this. So we'll be sending a follow-up email with the evaluation link, but we'll also be sharing it for those of you that just want to get it filled out today. And we really appreciate your feedback. So with that, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen to allow Andrew to get queued up. And then Matt, if you could go ahead and introduce Andrew.
Thanks, Amy. So our first speaker is Andrew Millison. He's been studying, teaching, and practicing permaculture since he took his first design course in 1996. He started teaching permaculture at the college level in 2001 and has been an instructor at OSU in the horticultural department since 2009. Andrew first learned permaculture in the drylands in the Southwest, where he studied at Prescott College for his undergraduate and master's degrees. In Arizona, his focus was on rainwater harvesting, gray water systems, and desert agriculture. Andrew has developed a successful online permaculture program through OSU, and in recent years moved into media production, traveling internationally to film and produce educational content focused on permacultural-based food and water systems. His YouTube video series, India's Water Revolution, has had over 1.3 million views in 2020 alone. And in his talk today, he will discuss the use of using landforms, swales, and broad-scale water management practices for farm climate resiliency and developmental planning, and also discuss some of the lessons he learned from his time touring Indian permaculture and water storage systems. So Andrew, take it away.
You're muted.
There we go. Okay, hello. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Great to be talking to you all today. I'm gonna try to move pretty fast because there's a lot of ground to cover here. And I'm gonna cover these 5 topics related to enhancing agricultural water resilience. So we're gonna start by talking about turning wastelands into agricultural lands, restoring degraded agricultural lands, integrated water storage and cropping systems, restoring agricultural watersheds, and regional effects of widespread water resilience. So, sorry, it is not allowing me to move on my slide here. Excuse me for 1 second. There we go. Okay, so I did a video series on my recent trip to India, and these are the videos that you'll be able to find on my YouTube channel. And the information that I'm going to be giving you today is primarily based off of the titles of these episodes. So you can get more information by visiting these episodes after we have our talk sometime in the future if you want to find out more. And I had the opportunity to travel around India and see some really spectacular projects, get on the back of motorcycles with my camera gear on my back right there in this backpack, and really got an amazing experience of the diversity of different types of systems that people are using for water and food resilience in the densely populated Indian landscape. So we'll start by just talking a little bit about climate. We've got temperature, precipitation and precipitation seasonality as the defining factors of the Köppen-Geiger climate classification system. So this is how people classify climates around the world. And when we look at India, we see that there are, hello?
Yeah, we don't see your slides, FYI.
Oh, okay. You don't see my slides. Share screen. Desktop share. Okay.
Now we can see them.
Now you see my slides.
Yeah.
And now, I'm sorry about that. If I go to view, if I go to play, now you see my slides, correct? Okay.
Yes.
Sorry about that. I'll just go back really quick. There's my opening slide there. There are the titles of the videos that I was mentioning there that you can find on my YouTube channel. This is the backpack with all my equipment there and me jumping on the back of motorcycles, going around the Indian landscape and meeting with all kinds of interesting farmers and permaculturists. And here is the Köppen-Geiger map of the world here, where we have climate types that are organized by temperature, precipitation, and precipitation seasonality. And then here is the climate types of India. Now, you can see that a lot of these climate types actually are not ones that we find in the United States. But the areas that I primarily visited are the orange color, which is arid steppe, so arid grasslands. And then in the upper left, you see that bright red, which is arid desert hot. That's the only climate type I visited that is sort of analogous to some US climate types, because that's about the same as Phoenix, Arizona, but a little bit hotter, actually. It's hard to imagine that. And then precipitation. So you can see that there's some areas, and on the left, bottom left side there, you see that blue, that's really wet. But if you move inland into the south center of the continent, you see some really arid areas in there. And so those are some of the areas that I primarily visited that I'm going to be showing you examples from. And those are areas that get, between, 3 and 900 millimeters of precipitation. So in the, like 15 to 20 inch range, but it all comes in intense monsoons. So we're going to start by looking at an example of turning wastelands into agricultural lands. And we're going to start on the Deccan Plateau here, where you see the red circle at a place called Irania Farm in the state of Telangana. Now, the people who created Irania Farm also, Narsana and Padma Coppola, they also hosted the International Permaculture Conference in 2017, and that is what brought me originally to India. And one of their missions is really to show how you can turn incredibly degraded and soilless lands into agricultural areas. Now, I have this image here. Their farm is highlighted with the colors there on this red plateau, which is, a lot of it is just bare lateritic bedrock. It's like not agricultural lands. Down below in the yellow areas is more valley bottom, still fairly marginal agricultural lands, but agricultural lands nonetheless. So they have a number of strategies that they employed to turn these bedrock areas into productive farmlands. And they have to do with, creating contour swales to intercept the water flow. And in this example, they work with really marginal farmers and people that were landless, who didn't even have land to grow on before. And just even to get some yield from their initial transition to landscape, they will plant crops like their native millets and such on the berm, the mound that they dig out from these ditches of loose soil. And then when the rains come and fill that basin up with water, the water seeps in and they'll actually grow a crop off of that residual moisture from rainfall on these bedrock areas. They also increase the water storage with even larger swales where they will plant perennial vegetation on the mounds. And a lot of times they do this on the field boundaries to create hedgerows grown from harvested water from the rainfall that flows across the landscape. And finally, they will just make little sunken, they call this a boomerang swale, where they will dig out an area, they'll create a little boomerang to harvest that water flowing across the landscape, and they'll fill it with mulch and organic matter, and they'll create a little node where they'll grow a fruit tree and vegetables underneath. And so using strategies like this, they have actually created whole productive farm systems that are establishing water resilience and agriculture on these really, really harsh soil conditions. So this is Irania Farm right here. And all of the rows of trees that you see were established using these swale methods that I showed you in the previous slides. And you can see that there's tree areas, and then in the center of the farm, there are some field areas. And one of their strategies in establishing these field areas is to surround it by trees. And the trees that are grown on the harvested water, rainwater, help to create this microclimate that is conducive for agriculture in a place where there's very hot sun, hot winds, and poor soil conditions. So they've really proven over, this is 20 years, that you can actually create a farm on these extreme bedrock conditions. So, the application to the US and other parts of the world is the fact that we can see that we can take wastelands. This is an area declared by the Indian government to be a wasteland, and that wastelands can actually be transitioned into farms by working with water retention in the landscape. And this is a little zoom in on their cropping systems here. So you can see they've got in the foreground, there's this perennial pigeon pea, and then we see some kind of garbanzo beans in the interplanted here. So they use a lot of nitrogen fixing perennials to establish regenerative soil systems once they've used the water harvesting to create the overall farm infrastructure. And using their traditional millets and traditional crops is another important aspect of the system here. So next, we're going to jump down to an even more arid area. We're going to talk about restoring degraded agricultural lands. Now, this is an area in Andhra Pradesh, just the driest part of the state of Andhra Pradesh, where due to recent drought, people have fled the area to go to the cities and had to abandon their farms for lack of water, right? So I visited down there with Padma Coppola, and we went and we saw some of the projects where here you can see in the walls these conglomerations of farmers who've gotten together and they have collectively designed the landscape that includes all of their farms. So they've gotten together and they've shown, they've combine their farms enough where they could really do some water harvesting at scale. And we can see some of the applications there. They've got compost pits, they're doing animal rotation, planting biomass, they're collecting crop residues for composting, and they have various water tanks and water harvesting within the system there. And, a lot of it is just taking these dry agricultural lands and just putting in these really simple water collection ponds, right? That simply take the runoff from the roads and the fields, they store it here, and then they have pumps and they pump it out for agriculture. And the significance is massive because traditionally, without water storage in this part of India, they would only grow one crop, which would be during the monsoon season. The monsoon rains would come, they'd plant their crop and they'd grow a crop, and then that was it for the year. Now, if the rains failed, which they certainly have in recent years, there's no water, there's zero crop, and people basically have to leave and migrate away. So just with the simple addition of these farm ponds, first off, they created resilience to having erratic rainfall and off-timing rainfall because of storage they can use to pump even during the monsoon season. But also, they oftentimes have enough water to grow a second crop during the winter dry season, which is when I'm here visiting. And here you can see this is cotton that they're growing. This is a big cotton area. And because of the water that you can see in the background, they're able to grow multiple crops in the year, which for the farmer, it basically stabilizes their economy, stabilizes their yields, where they have enough money definitely to not have to leave their landscape, and in fact become prosperous just with the addition of a second crop and an assured irrigation for the first crop throughout the year. Now, there's some other strategies they're employing, and this is actually traditional, which is just the field boundaries between fields are raised water harvesting berms, right? So each field itself acts as a mound that makes the whole field into like a little mini collection basin. And then planting trees on these mounds as well helps to protect against wind, create some microclimate, and the trees can be productive as well, adds another productive layer. So just this simply taking flat fields and putting water harvesting structures as the field boundaries and planting trees changes the water security and the nature of the landscape in incredible ways. That has allowed people to stay on their lands in this circumstance. Another thing that they've also done is used traditional materials to create biofertilizers to replace. So they use neem seeds to actually create a biofertilizer instead of using chemical nitrogen fertilizer, which pollutes the water table with over nitrification. So another aspect to this, besides the water, are actually bringing back traditional biofertilizer techniques. So now we're actually going to jump to a wetter part of the country here, and we're going to look at integrated water storage and cropping systems. So this is up in West Bengal. I went to the dry areas of West Bengal, but this is still wetter because this is right next door to Bangladesh. There's a lot of big tropical storms that come up through here. So they have to deal with drought, but they also have to deal with intense flooding from time to time as well. So I went around with this NGO there and filmed a lot of these pond systems. We actually just came upon this. We didn't intend to visit this pond. We just drove by and there was like 100 people digging this pond by hand, right? So all of the reservoirs in this area are dug by hand by hundreds of people carrying pans and pots, what we think of, but they're sort of like buckets full of soil, one scoop at a time. These massive reservoirs are excavated. And this particular NGO called DRCSC, they have pioneered this system of storage ponds that are terraced. So here you can see these terraces in the margin. You can also see these ramps going down the ponds. So these ponds fill up with the monsoon rains, but as the water is used down below, or as the water level just goes down through evaporation, these terraces are actually planted and cultivated. So the pond surface area itself becomes a cultivation zone. Here's another example here. These women, this pond was mostly dug by women in this area here. I believe there was 100 people dug this pond in 80 days, this reservoir. And it's a large reservoir. And you can see that they're standing on these planted terraces that have been revealed with the dropping water level, right? So it's just making use of the change of the water level. And this is a diagram I drew here that shows the water level as it gets low and shows how all the different surfaces are being used to grow crops here. So there's these terraces are being revealed, and then the ramps are actually allow for animal access to come down and drink, and people access to come and collect water from here. And then the embankments are also planted as well. And here's a picture of one of these ponds here. And this is the one that we saw in the preceding slide with the women standing there. And this is down below the ponds. So these ponds are not sealed tight. There's seepage actually designed into these ponds. And so the fields down from the ponds, the crops are grown just from the seepage that's flowing subsurface from these ponds. And you can see the embankments planted. That's Rosella in the foreground there, and all types of different crops. And so, I think this actually has a lot of application in the US because a lot of people are building ponds, building reservoirs, but you do not see this concept of actually having the embankments and having the levels of the reservoir be more growing areas. And then also, the idea of planning ponds for seepage. Planning seepage and subsurface irrigation as part of the pond planning, really, like, we're told, okay, you want to maximize the compaction in the bottom of a reservoir because we don't want water seeping out, right? That's kind of the conventional wisdom around ponds. But to actually build ponds to be these slow seepage units is an interesting concept, I think, that we could introduce here. So next we jump over to the state of Maharashtra. And this, again, is in that same arid band that I showed you early on when we were looking at the rainfall and the climate. Now, the story from Maharashtra is really different. And to see the full story, you actually have to watch the videos. It takes about 22 minutes to watch to get the whole story. And I'm going to show you a couple clips here. However, in short, there's a very famous Bollywood star named Amir Khan who initiated a contest between villages in the state of Maharashtra to see which village could build the most amount of water harvesting structures in 45 days, right? And so they did this contest for 4 years in a row, and they had in the neighborhood of 8,000 villages compete in this contest. So, I mean, if you think of 8,000 villages, each village has a area that they're controlling that, numbers anywhere from, 3 to 8 square miles or so. So we're talking about broad scale water harvesting effects across the landscape. And I'm going to show you, this is an example right here of the watershed of a village. And this is the watershed of one of the clips that I'm going to show you. And you can see the high ground surrounding this watershed, and you can see the crop fields are in the low areas mostly. And this is a good example of the scale of the average Indian village landscape. And the amazing thing that I'd say India has a real advantage over the US is the villages and, we might say towns are planned naturally because they've been in these locations for a long, long time. They're planned naturally around existing watershed units, right? So if that community decides to restore the watershed, they have control over, common shared use over many of the lands in the entire watershed. Where in the US, a lot of our land, our boundaries of our landscapes are divided on grids that don't correspond to the natural boundaries of the watershed. So that's kind of one of the advantages that they have there. So I'm going to exit here, and I am going to bring up a clip here. Now, I know sometimes when you show a video through Zoom, sometimes the sound lags a little bit, but I do have subtitles on these videos. I'm going to show you 2 clips of about 1 minute and 15 seconds each. So I'll play these, and if there's any glitch with it coming through, you can always watch these clips later, and I have links to them as well. So here we go. Rotational grazing of large herds of goats. The main structures used to harvest water here are called CCTs, or continuous contour trenches. These are the same structures that we call on-contour swales in the United States.
in the month of December, they start facing a problem of a water scarcity every year. This year, they took a part in a water cup competition. This was the first year. They treat a watershed in a different areas. You can see the hilly areas. No? These are the three hilly areas. One is this, second is this, third is this, and fourth and fifth. Fifth hilly areas. From the top, they started the work. Right now we are on the top surface area. On the top surface area, we preferred CCTs. The treatment is a CCT. These are the CCTs. These CCTs made by the machines. It is around 1 meter by 1 meter. So CCT is I think basic treatment plan in a watershed development. This is the basic. Otherwise, what happened?
Okay. So that's the, that's the first clip. And now I'm going to show you the second clip here.
Because it is on the rocky based.
So although this reservoir has a large watershed of over 1,100 acres, it was built over bedrock and was not soaking any water into the groundwater table. Even though lots of rain would run off during the monsoon season, the water would just spill through the reservoir and flow on down the stream and out of the village without recharging the groundwater table. Meanwhile, as the village was drying up, 4 water percolation tanks just up from the village sat mostly empty. These tanks were built originally to fill with rains and recharge the groundwater in the village, but they have much smaller areas of land draining into them and had not filled during the last 25 years of relative drought. The villagers realized that if they raised the level of the spillway, what Dr. Pohl referred to as a waste weir, then the water level in the whole reservoir would rise. And instead of all the water gushing through the spillway, they could get the water to flow through a gate on the other side of the reservoir. This gate then puts the water into an underground pipeline that flows by gravity using no electricity. And the water is moved across the land to the other 4 percolation tanks to fill them up. From the tanks, the water soaks into the groundwater table and is stored in the ground for village and farm use. So instead of a All right. So let's go back to So, when we look at this type of systems that they are employing on the village watershed type. So I showed you 2 different examples. One were the continuous contour trenches, which in the US, a lot of times people refer to them as on contour swales. And then we also showed you an example of bringing water from a reservoir out of its micro watershed and actually distributing it into adjacent watersheds. And a lot of the patterns that they're using there are similar to some of the well-known water harvesting systems like the Keyline design system. So imagine that this type of intensity of design has been put in place, not just in the 2 small examples that we saw, but in 8,000 villages across an entire state. So when water harvesting is put into practice at that scale, we start to actually have regional groundwater shifts, right? So, I titled this section Restoring Agricultural Watersheds because, you're restoring the watershed, and then the effects on agriculture is that you're actually building a groundwater reserve. So it's the same situation in this case where people can now grow 2 crops a year instead of 1 crop a year, and that keeps people from needing to migrate away. I think the application of this for the United States is just showing that on a biophysical level, that we can actually sculpt the earth and restore groundwater tables localized by doing watershed restoration. I mean, we learn this stuff in permaculture courses, we learn this in watershed restoration, in restoration courses, but to actually see the scale of the structures and then see the groundwater that's been restored is like, oh, this can be done in depleted water situations, especially throughout the arid lands of the US. So let me, here's one of the groups that I visited there. And this is one of the full reservoirs behind us all, and these proud farmers who have had all this work done. And here we are looking on the other side of that reservoir down below, and this is a well, a big, open well, and you can see the green fields in the background. Now, this is the result of the watershed restoration work that was done in the upper watershed. So now the last topic we're going to look at are the regional effects of widespread water resilience. And you can see at the tippy top left of this map here, there's a red circle, and that's up in Rajasthan. So we're going to go up to, it's in the beginning of this presentation when I showed you that slide, and I said there was one area that actually has the same climate type as Phoenix, Arizona, except a little bit hotter. So we're going to go up to the desert. This was my first trip to India here. And this green landscape here, this is the dry season, this is in January. And this area is only green because of irrigation. And the only reason they have irrigation water to pump out of the ground is because of this really broad scale water harvesting systems that I'm going to show you a little bit about here. So I'm going to exit again, and I'm going to jump on to Google Earth for a second. Okay. And we're going to be looking at this area right here. Here's Pakistan and the Thar Desert. This is the most densely inhabited desert on the planet. It's 25 million people that live in this desert. So as we're zooming in, and I hope that the resolution that you can see, so we see this brown color, but we see this green right here. All of the green that we see basically from space, this is all irrigated land. So as we zoom in, we see all of this green are patches of fields. Now, on Google Earth, I can look down here at the imagery date. This tells me this is 12/30. So this is December 30th, 2016. This is the height of the dry season. I mean, December's like very dry up here, which means that all of the lands that we see are irrigated landscapes. Now, as I zoom in, we're going to look at just one example. You could almost zoom in anywhere on this landscape at random, and you could see these techniques in use. Now, as we zoom in, we actually now the imagery date has changed to 9/7. So this is a September 7th. This is a lot closer to the monsoons. So this is actually a wetter period. So I kind of brought us to a wetter period so we could see the structures really well. So this is a rocky area here. You can see these roads are on the ridges. There's all windmills up here. And then from the rocky areas, we have multiple collection ponds that are built into the landscape here. And then as we go down to the fields, we find a common feature. And these are just some of the common features. We see this wall, and the wall is a boundary wall, but it's also a water harvesting wall. So first, they will have a wall that breaks the force of the water coming off of these rocky slopes. And then below the wall, they have a big on contour swale or ditch to soak the water in. And then each one of these field boundaries, just like we saw in previous images, each one of these field boundaries is a raised berm that holds the monsoon rains back to flood each field, right? And so just using these simple techniques, which are detention basins, these aren't meant for irrigation. I'm going to go back in time a little bit on Google Earth just to look and show how, see now we go back to, this is January 31st, 2019. These are dry. So these structures are not meant necessarily to hold irrigation water, but they're meant to take water and have it sit here and then soak in order to recharge the groundwater table. And then here again, this is the height of the dry season, but we see these irrigated fields and we see some small ponds within the landscape here. These are similar to some of the ones we saw in previous slides in other locations. And this is the effects of groundwater recharge only, because before they had these structures in the landscape, before they built these walls, these detention ponds and mounded between the fields, there was no cropping at this time of year. There was only cropping during the monsoon season. So if you think about that, and then you zoom back out at this wider scale, all of these green areas, right? This is a vast area, have similar treatments to what we just looked at. So here we actually are seeing these broad regional effects of the compounding of hundreds of thousands of small scale water harvesting structures compounding over a vast area to literally change the regional hydrology, the food security, and the water security for tens of millions of people, right? So that's like, you know, that it blows my mind, and it's the real deal. I mean, this is the scale at which we need to restore agricultural landscapes. And so, like we said, this is Phoenix, Arizona, you know, or this is go down south into Mexico. This is many places in the world share this same climate type. The Southwest US has monsoonal rains. Now, the major difference between this situation and the US hydrologically is that they don't have a lot of deep bore wells here. A lot of the water is accessed as surface water, where in the US, we're digging very deep and pulling water from lower levels of the aquifer, often for agricultural lands. So we're here, surface treatments will directly translate to groundwater in that region. In the US, a lot of our agricultural lands are actually decoupled from the aquifer. So what you do on the surface and what's happening to the aquifer, because it's so deep, it may be affected by an area that is much more remote for its recharge. So that's one thing that it's going to vary region by region, where this is not necessarily directly applicable to like industrial scale agriculture in the US. So I'm going to jump back on and I'm going to share with you my some contact information for me. So to see the India's Water Revolution video series, you can go to YouTube, and I'm just A. Millison, or you can just type in Andrew Millison on YouTube and it'll come to my page. And I have a whole playlist. It's at the top, India's Water Revolution. Aside from Oregon State University's various websites, Permaculture Rising is a place where you can go to see the course listings that we offer. And if you want to get in touch with me directly, if you want to talk about this more, have questions or comments, that is my Oregon State University email. And this picture right here is actually, just want to say, it's such a gorgeous little shot. This is from a place in Rajasthan called Bundi. It's this old fortress town, and you can climb this old palace that is partly restored and partly it's just kind of wrecked. And there, hanging from the palace, was this native cluster of bees just living right there on the palace adornments. So I thought that was an interesting shot. So that is my presentation, and I believe we have some time for questions. I didn't know if Amy or someone was going to facilitate that. And I guess I should stop sharing my screen here, and I'll let you guys organize the Q&A part of this.
Oh, great. Thank you, Andrew. I've been wanting to, I've seen some of your videos, but I was really excited to hear your synthesis of all of your trip to India and what you learned there. So I learned a lot. Do you have those last two slides just for the evaluation link to share,
Yes.
Andrew?
Do you want me to do that now or while we do the, because I knew we were going to take questions first.
Yeah, maybe we'll go ahead and take questions and we can put that up at the end. So yeah, the chat box is a great place to enter your questions. I know that we, Matt, would you mind going ahead and facilitating? I don't know if there was any that came in
Sure.
other than Carolina.
Right. Yeah, Carolina had a question around planting trees and if that influences the rates of evapotranspiration around some of the retention, water retention ponds and things like that, Andrew.
Yeah, so you know, definitely having some shade on the water, on the ponds, lessens the evapotranspiration within the ponds. However, you didn't see many trees planted directly like on the embankments, for example, because that will compromise the roots of the trees get in there and can compromise the structure of the embankments. So, you know, I actually was just thinking how like a lot of those terraces, as they're revealed in the ponds where the water level changes, I think you could do trees on those terraces that could take that inundation for part of the year and then drop down. It seems like you could do trees, some varieties of trees, and you would have this more interesting effect where you have trees right around the water that would lessen the evaporation from the pond itself. But the trees around the water harvesting structures in general actually increase overall soil moisture, especially in the agricultural field, like where you see the trees on those berms, you know, in the swales, where you see the trees that were planted like as hedgerows on the water collection structures. They, you know, for one thing, they block desiccating winds. And so that's a really important feature. And then they just add general soil structure by, you know, because the leaves fall and it incorporates more organic matter into the agricultural fields. So does that answer the question?
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, absolutely. And just a quick follow-up is that when you talk about say terms around agroforestry, is that considered, is this type of system, a combination would be considered an agroforestry system?
Yeah, this definitely is agroforestry type of systems, especially the integration of the trees into these structures. And well, in the Indian landscape, other thing is there's so many animals, right? There's so many grazing animals that silvopasture, I mean, there's a lot of trees, different tree species that are planted for animal forage everywhere. It's definitely a big part because, I mean, it's actually coming from the American landscape. It's a little bit overwhelming how many animals there are everywhere. And so, you know, so we definitely see the silvopasture element in the agroforestry systems. You know, I think that I focused to some degree on the field cropping because, you know, people are really fixated because they're, you know, India is such a place where people need to grow grains and pulses and, you know, but there are other systems that I visited that I didn't show in this that are a lot more forestry type of systems. So those definitely exist out there that are a lot more trees, you know, integrated with these water harvesting systems and less of the field cropping that we saw in this presentation.
Gotcha. Well, that's great. That's great. And okay, let's see. I think one of our last questions here has to do with if we were to bring these kinds of systems here to, say, the Pacific Northwest and Oregon, are there any kind of legal considerations that you're aware of for surface water harvesting? Now, I know Amy is going to be talking about Oregon water law in her presentation, but I just wondered if you were interested in commenting about that.
Yeah, well, I have found, and again, you're going to get a much more in-depth presentation of this later. I have found that in general, the state of Oregon seems very open to surface water harvesting during the winter months, right? And I've applied and gotten water rights for a project, and I have friends that have gotten water rights for projects as well. And you know, a lot of the structures, just like the berms and swales and such, I mean, that's just drainage, right? I mean, that's just grading and drainage. That's not something that you really need any sort of permitting for. It's when you're impounding water in a reservoir that you actually need to have a water right. But a lot of the stuff of just creating roads, creating runoff areas, swales, and you know, slowing water throughout the landscape, I mean, that's just basic grading and drainage that anybody that is managing a landscape needs to do some management of the surface water flow. So, you know, there's a line when you actually enter the water rights territory, and there's a lot of smaller, more passive water harvesting structures that you can do before you cross that line.
Great, great. Thanks very much, Andrew. I think that covers most of the questions that I've seen, unless anybody had any additional questions for Andrew.
There's another question in there from Al LePage. I could read this one off.
Sure, please do.
So regarding recharging aquifers in urban areas, should we all be disconnecting our downspouts?
I definitely think we should be disconnecting the downspouts. Although there's a caveat, and the caveat is, where is your neighborhood located within the greater landscape? Because if your neighborhood is actually located in a former wetland, it has been transitioned through the draining of water into a place where you could build houses, then if you went and disconnected all the downspouts in that neighborhood and you brought the water table back to very close to the surface, then you could actually create problems. So, you know, so I would say you want to assess where your neighborhood's at. Because I know, like, just for instance, where I live right here, I mean, in my neighborhood in Corvallis, just down for me, when you look at historic aerial imagery, there used to be a big drainage swale going through the neighborhood, and now there are houses over that old drainage swale because everything is now piped and drained underground. Well, if everybody around here went and disconnected their downspouts and we restored the natural hydrology of this neighborhood, those houses that were built in those low areas would have some serious problems right now. So, you know, that's the caveat. But overall, yeah, I mean, the amount of water that comes off of our roofs, when you do the calculations, it's tremendous, a tremendous amount of water. You know, the average home in Corvallis can easily have close to 100,000 gallons a year coming off of the roof, you know, if it's a good size, couple thousand square feet. So, yeah, I'm a big advocate of disconnecting downspouts. And the video that I'm about to put out, that I'm about 90% done with, in India, is from the city of Chennai, where they actually ran out of water, a city of 10 million people, in 2019, in the dry period. And the video I did is about one family that did water harvesting on their 1/10 of an acre, and just taking all of the water falling on a 1/10 of an acre and putting it into the ground in water storage, in recharge wells. They actually maintained their micro groundwater table throughout the drought when the rest of the city was drying up, and there was like people bringing in water on trains because they literally ran out of water. So, you know, another lesson from what I saw there, and especially, you know, and for urban areas too, is don't underestimate the power of recharging water at a really small scale, and the hydrologic effects of even small scale, small plot recharge at the urban level. Yeah.
Great, that's terrific. And I see we do have one more question here about harvesting rainwater in the broad landscape. Can you enhance water volumes of rivers and perennial creeks, and maybe enhance ephemeral creeks to become perennial?
Yeah, so this is actually another site I want to visit in India is in Rajasthan. I've only heard about it, seen videos on it, where they did so much water harvesting on a large scale off of this whole mountain range that they restored an entire river from only flowing ephemerally during the monsoons to becoming a perennialized river, right? And so I've seen this on a smaller scale, like down in Southern Oregon, you know, when you visit places like Seven Seeds Farm in Williams, where he's got probably 30 or 40 acres where he's doing a lot of water harvesting and into reservoirs and has this whole system here. He's actually just in the creek in his plot of that scale, he's turned his stream from intermittent to perennial, and his neighbors downstream, their spring levels went up, their well levels went up. So, you know, this is it's totally possible when you're working on the watershed scale to turn ephemeral streams back into perennial streams. Yeah, we see examples of this. I see one. Is there a video how this method in YouTube? Yeah, actually. So again, on my YouTube channel, I made this video about 7 years ago. It's called Permaculture Keyline Water Systems Dawn Tipping at Seven Seeds Farm. So if you just go to my YouTube channel and you go to my videos, it's one of the very first videos. I have like 32 videos. I did one on this project, Dawn Tipping's place, Seven Seeds Farm. I did another one on Wolf Gulch Farm, which is near Roosh in the Little Applegate Valley. And both of those are great local Oregon examples of large scale water harvesting. And another great example, they just is at Aprovecho, which is fairly local to us, and that's outside Cottage Grove. And Aprovecho, they have done a fairly large scale pond systems. They just won a contest from the Permaculture Institute North America, and they just built a much larger reservoir as part of their system. But they have changed the hydrology on their 40-acre kind of wooded plot just through water harvesting. And they just actually there's a video on if you go to on YouTube on the Permaculture Institute North America, if you go on their YouTube channel, they just put out a video documenting the broad scale water harvesting ponds at Aprovecho. So it's another local resource for you.
I have a question for you, Andrew. So you were commenting on, you know, India has all these villages and they're able to organize because they're located within a watershed. So they're not like sharing watersheds per se. And in Oregon and then the United States in general, a lot of those lines aren't so clear cut. There's a lot of overlapping. And I was wondering if you've been a part of any conversations, what would it take for us to organize based on watersheds? Have you been a part of these conversations, or is that already happening?
I mean, there are like local watershed councils, right? And the, I mean, I know there's the Marys River Watershed Council. And so there's nonprofits organized around that. And there's certainly government integration with those types of like the Mary, there's the Lukiamute Watershed Council. So those exist. I mean, I've got to say that I think that the fundamental flaw of our civilization, Western civilization, is the fact that we have taken gridded property ownership boundaries and imposed them on a non-gridded landscape. So we have a really big challenge because we have a fragmented property ownership system. And so if your upstream neighbor doesn't care, doesn't have the same information that you do, then there's not a whole lot you can do. We don't have like watershed protection laws innately. So, I think that's one of our biggest challenges. And there's certainly stories of communities getting together and people understanding, broad scale effects, but we have I think that there's a much bigger hurdle in this country because of the way that our properties are divided and our property rights. India has this great advantage that the villages have been there for a long, long time, at the point where people understood the natural divisions of landscape, and so they base their property. So that's like a real advantage they have, and that's a real disadvantage we have. So I wish I had a better answer to how to overcome that, but that's one of the main challenges I think that we face. Yeah.
Thank you, Andrew. It looks like we have another question from Susan. Are there specific efforts in Portland urban areas for recharging aquifers beyond training from the East Multnomah Soil and Water Conservation District or Metro? It seems as though, unless you are researching, it is not well known in urban areas.
Does anybody else know the answer to that question? Because I don't know the answer to that question, if there's specific like watershed scale properties. The one thing I could say about Portland is that the Bull Run watershed, the fact that Portland's drinking water is primarily from the Bull Run watershed, at least historically, and that, it's this pure watershed that sits above Portland. There are not many urban areas that have that situation, where you actually have a gravity-fed water supply from a protected watershed sitting above the city, right? Corvallis has, we have the watershed coming off the Mary's Peak, but at this point, our demand has outstripped that water source, and so we pull the majority of our water now. I think something like 70% from the Willamette River, and we get about 30% from that watershed. I think Portland also pulls water from the Columbia or the Willamette. So, that's one cool thing about Portland, where people can really kind of unify and get together, because the fact that your water supply is like, if anybody's read the S.M. Stirling novels and sort of post-apocalyptic Oregon situation, and Portland actually survives as a city because when everything goes down, Portland still has water. And that was a cute observation. You're like, yeah, Portland has this natural resilience. So I don't know the answer to your question, but I do know that that's an awesome thing about Portland and your watershed. And that's something that the people of Portland should be able to unify around, because everybody's drinking that water. Yeah, so I know that Portland does pull water from wells as well. So, because Portland's outstripped their water supply. So it would be interesting. I don't know what the percentage is, like how much of Portland still running the Bull Run. That would be interesting to know. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you, Andrew. So if there's no more questions, we can go ahead and would you mind pulling up those last few slides, Andrew?
Hey, let me share my screen. Okay. And oops. Let's go here. Okay. So here's slide 1. Please take a few moments to fill out this evaluation. You can talk, Amy.
Yeah.
Tell me when to switch it.
Sure. Yeah, the QR code's kind of covering up the link, but we do have the link for the evaluation in the chat box. So if you aren't planning to attend any more sessions, we just like to request that you fill out the evaluation. And if you could just go to the last slide, Andrew. And I just also want to mention that these sessions are all being recorded. So they're going to be archived on our website, dryfarming.org. And yeah, so the next session is going to be starting at 11 o'clock, and it's going to be with Amy Landvoigt And a lot of the questions around water law, and I know a lot of our participants are from Oregon, Amy is going to be going into a bit more depth around that. So I hope you can rejoin at 11 o'clock and give you a nice healthy break here in between. Okay, we do have a request for the updated agenda to be shared again in the chat box. Yes, we can do that. It's a table though. Let's see, Tegan, would you mind helping us with that, just so that folks have that? Yeah, and Tegan also highlights, we're going to be putting everybody back in the waiting room. So you're welcome to stay logged on, but we're going to move you to the waiting room because we will be getting set up for the second presentation. And then we'll let you back in when we get started with our second session. All right.